you?
I'm doing well. You?
We're good.
Good.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in, I don't know, 30 seconds or so. And now my clock is 11. Let's go, shall we?
Yep. Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in on what is a rainy day in Chicago. I hope you have better weather wherever you are. My name is Amy Schiffman. I'm one of the co-founders and principals of Giving Tree Associates. We are a consulting firm serving nonprofits based in Chicago, but we serve nonprofits all over North America and even outside of North America, with all things fundraising, strategic planning, executive recruiting, and board and leadership development. And I have asked Alisha Oberman to be a part of this conversation because she spends a lot of time thinking every single day about how we build stronger, better boards. I'm going to let you introduce yourself for a minute, Alisha.
Hi, I'm Alisha Oberman. I am the founder of the Board Member Institute, which actually does mean I think every day about what it means to build better boards and work with boards and build a stronger relationship between board members and senior staff professionals. I have been doing this work in one way or another for the last 3 years, and actually moved over to do it full-time professionally to expand out our work January of this year. So I do think about this all the time, and Amy and I have very interesting.
Alisha, I think
very frequently, and so I'm really excited to be here. Sorry?
Sorry, you froze for a sec, but you're back.
Oh, okay, sorry. We're working on our internet connection. I'm sure you guys have kids being homeschooled. Well, so do we. So I tried to kick them all off. So let's cross our fingers.
We will cross our fingers.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I will keep it short because I want to hear from you more than anything. So thank you.
Thanks for being here. So I'm going to share my screen and just give you a sense of how we envision this conversation rolling out today. And really what we're hoping to do is spend a very large chunk of our time today answering your questions. Alisha and I want to do some framing right up front. So I'm going to talk about really sort of do a review in terms of the role of the board in general, and then talk more specifically about the role of the board in capacity building, especially as it relates to functioning within a COVID-19 economy. I'm then going to throw this over to Alisha, who's also going to talk about the traditional role of the board and relate it to what's happening in today's world from the perspective of planning and operations. Then we're going to start taking your questions, and we're both going to touch on the reframing of your story, how your case for support is changing, and how, again, the board's role has to change with that, and sort of the new messaging training that you might have to offer to your board members as a result of everything that's going on. So that's our plan. Again, I'm going to start out. I'll throw it to Alisha, then we're going to open it up to you to get, I hope, all of your questions answered. Any questions that we don't get to today, by the way, I promise we will answer in writing. So we will get back to you one way or another. If we don't get to your questions today, we'll answer those questions in writing. And you'll also have an opportunity when we send you the video, we'll send you the recording. Yes, it's being recorded. I always get asked that. We'll send you the recording of this webinar with an opportunity to sign on for complimentary 30-minute coaching with Giving Tree Associates. So again, if there's anything we don't cover that's more organization specific and you really just need an opportunity to dig in with a member of the consulting team, or even with Alisha, I'll volunteer her. I know that we're both willing, our teams are both willing to answer questions for you offline. Okay, so I hope this is a review. I just want us to be on the same page as we're thinking about the board member role during unprecedented times, to just what is the board member role all the time, not just in unprecedented times. And usually when I'm doing a face-to-face training, I ask the board to give me their job description. In other words, if you as a board member or you as a professional were attempting to recruit me to the board, what would you say about that position? How would you describe that position? What does it entail? And I would push you in person to really define that without going back and looking at your board manual or whatever documentation you have to refer to. And generally what I get is something like this. And I think that this is a fairly accurate, if we have to boil it down to the work of the board into bullet points or boxes, here's generally where that work plays out. One is in relationship building. So a lot of board members will say, well, we're ambassadors for the organization. Absolutely. Your role is to be an ambassador for the organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but that's relationship building for and on behalf of the organization. The second I've sort of put into one bucket is this fiscal oversight and fundraising. So the capacity building that we do to ensure that our organization has the resources that it needs to function and fulfill its mission. So some of us will be serving on the finance committee, others of us will be serving on a fundraising or development committee. But every board member, regardless of whether or not they sit on those two committees, will be involved in hopefully approving a campaign budget, a fundraising budget, or fundraising plans, and working to help the organization successfully achieve those fundraising goals. By the way, I realized that I forgot a little piece of housekeeping. If you have a question, will you please put it in the Q&A box below? I will try and check the chat box as well, but if you can stick your questions in the Q&A box, I'm going to be looking at them and preparing questions for Alisha and I later. Either way is fine. I prefer the Q&A box. Okay, third, vision, mission, planning. And again, this is a lot to lump into these small boxes, but I put that third area, vision, mission, planning. The board owns strategic planning. Even if strategic planning involves a lot of professional time, energy, and expertise, typically that is a board guided exercise. That is a board driven and board owned responsibility. The vision, the mission, and the planning. And so I know Alisha is going to get into some of the planning and sort of operational work that we hope you're involved in during this time in a few minutes. And last is really, and again, this is not exhaustive, but this is sort of the work of the board sort of boiled down, is CEO, executive director, your lead professional support and evaluation. So the board, as I'm sure you know, hires and fires the CEO or the executive director. But in addition, there's more to it than that. The board is responsible for supporting that work and ensuring that the board as a whole is doing the work to partner with the CEO and with the professional team to get the job done in order to, again, help them fulfill the mission, but also to evaluate that work. So I hope your board has some committee, whether it's the executive committee, committee on trustees, the governance committee, who is, and a subset of that group is typically the committee that supports and evaluates the executive director. Those are the basic, this is the basic work of the board in a nutshell. And so what I want to do is sort of zero in on, okay, if that's true, how does that happen? We can't all do all those things all of the time. That is true. And that is why we have standing board committees. Typically, your board org chart may look nothing like this, and that's okay. But if you have 10 more, moving my cursor, if you have 10 more boxes down on the bottom here, I get like a little panic attack looking at that when I look at your board org chart, and I wonder why you need so many standing board committees. You may need subcommittees of these basic committees. So when I see audit, oh, that falls under finance. When I see an alumni committee as a standing board committee, maybe not, falls under development. I really want you to think about concentrating the work of the board into these areas, and then argue with yourself or argue with me during a coaching call about why you need more standing board committees than this. right? These are the committees that are described in your bylaws. These are the committees that are offered as opportunities to new board members and existing board members. And it is my opinion, and I will see if Alisha shakes her head yes or no, that every board member must play a role on at least one standing board committee. Yeah, she says yes. Okay, we're in agreement. Yes, every board member must play a role in a standing board committee. There should be no, when I see the words member at large next to people's names, I wonder, what does that mean? What's your job? What's your focus on the board? We all need a focus. The work of the board does not happen in the boardroom, ladies and gentlemen. The work of the board happens at the committee level. And so although I hope you're having really robust, interesting, productive conversations during your board meetings, the work of the board is happening typically offline in the committee environment. And so you have to really, if the work of the board, again, let's go back to this slide, falls into these areas, then the committee structure that you develop must represent those areas, must help support those areas. And generally these do. You may also, what would be acceptable to me would be to have another box that was sort of your strategic planning committee, right? Is that an ad hoc committee? Is that a committee that functions or sort of dials up during strategic planning, development or evaluation where we're checking in on the strategic plan? Fine, I'm happy to see that on this chart. I'm nervous to see a lot more than this on this chart. And again, we can debate that offline, but this is really where the work of the board is being done and how we focus the board on capacity building. If you have many more boxes, if you have many more opportunities to do your work as a board member by, for example, serving on the facilities committee, if that's really your job and that's it, although that might be a critical function for your organization, does that person need to be a board member? Is it possible to have a facilities committee that is even chaired by and staffed by non-board members? Must that be a board member role? Do not confuse a great volunteer for a great board member. The board is typically held to different standards, higher standards. Again, don't confuse a great volunteer for a great board member. You will not lose people if you put them on committees rather than on the board if they cannot live up to board expectations. Okay, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because I could talk all day about that. I want to get into, right?
Yeah.
That's like a 6-part web series right there.
Absolutely.
I want to get into the work of the board in capacity building, and I want to specifically get into talking about what that means right now. Why this role that the board plays in building capacity, financial capacity for the organization is more important than it ever was or maybe ever will be. That's a dramatic statement, but I really mean it that way. There's never been a time in my experience, and I've been working in this field 25 years, where we need our boards so laser focused on capacity building because things are scary, because people are out of work, because we don't know when facilities will open. So maybe your organization is okay right now. I've talked to a lot of people over the past couple of weeks who say, you know what, I'm really in good shape in terms of my fundraising budget to date. I'm not so worried about now. I am sort of worried about next year. Yes, the board should be worried about both this year, if this year is scary for you, but 100% worried about next year. And if we have not asked our boards to take on these responsibilities yet, is my voice rising? You can see I'm like peaking here in terms of what I'm worried about. If you have not asked them to play this role yet, if you have not needed them to play this role yet, I assure you, I promise you, you do now. And so all board members really need to think about the roles that they play. Where do they come in on this chart? Are they truly partners with staff? Are they looking at your campaign goals for next year? Maybe you already approved your budget for next year. I don't care. You need to pull that out and look at it again. Does it reflect the reality of your organization? Are you expecting for you, by the way, day schools, synagogues, camps, any organization that has these membership or tuition-based revenue programs that we may not be able to count on? Families who were not looking for financial assistance in the past may be looking for the first time. Families who are already seeking financial assistance or receiving financial assistance from the institution may need more or may not be able to pay at all. Are you prepared as an organization to respond to that? Will people just assume you're not because you're not telling them you're ready? And will they leave the organization? Will they leave the school? Will they leave the synagogue? Will they, whatever it is, are you prepared to develop a case for support and go out and talk to donors about the reality of what your needs may look like next year? I know May is a scary word. We don't know exactly what your constituents are going to need, but we know they will need. We know it will be dramatic. We know it will be much worse than whatever you experienced between 2007 and 2012. So the board has to prepare to respond to that. And one of the best ways it can do that is to play a role in capacity building and rethink those plans, those fundraising plans right now. Approve those plans. Don't just, give your yes via email. Really dig into those plans that your development team is making for next year, and figure out what your role is in making that happen. Our boards must be proactive, must understand the plans, and must be a part of the solution. So what I like to do is, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, that comes from Kay Sprinkle Grace's AAA guide to board fundraising success. And I give her credit on the next page. She likes to put ask board members to take on one of three categories. I'll just skip there and I'll come back. Ambassadors, advocate, or askers. Ambassadors are sort of the frontline people, frontline board members. They are people who are out and about. I call them the door openers, people who can really open the door to relationships with new board members and volunteers, and especially new donors. Advocates are really the engagers. So they take the work, and maybe this is the same person, but maybe it isn't. The ambassador and advocate may be two different people with two different skill sets. The advocate is taking that person to the next level, is really talking about the case for giving to this potential donor, or talking about the organization and strategic plan to a potential board member. And then the asker is a little bit more obvious, someone who is comfortable, again, laying out that case for support and asking for the gift. So when you think about the role that your board can be playing right now, all of those three A's, ambassador, advocate, asker, play out somewhere on here. Where is your board? Everyone needs to adopt at least one of those roles. Some of them will play all three, fantastic. But everyone has to find their place in capacity building for the organization. And your job as a board leader or as a professional is to redefine what fundraising is. When you start talking about capacity building or fundraising to your board, many of them get nervous. Maybe many of them start to sweat and think there's no way. I'm never asking people for money. I can't be part of that. I'll do anything but. If you reframe that, and if you allow your board as a whole and your organization as a whole to look at philanthropy different and say every single thing along this line, along this spectrum counts as fundraising. You introducing us to a prospect in your network, a family member, a colleague, whoever it is fundraising. We don't need you to ask for the gift. In fact, if you get hives from thinking about asking for a gift, you're not going to be a great solicitor. You probably should never do it unless you really want coaching, and we can change that. But if that's not your thing, that's okay. We want you to redefine what it means for board members to be involved and help them experience success just by coming up with a list of prospects, just by calling donors to say thank you on behalf of the board. That is fundraising. It's all fundraising. It's not just solicitation. And if you reframe that, if you correct that line of thinking for board members, they will more willingly participate in the work that you need them to do right now. So again, if you want more on this, you check out Kay Sprinkle Grace's. She has a book. She has a website that talks about this. We also have a worksheet that we can share with her permission. If you want your board to engage in this exercise, it is a great time to get board members to commit to playing one or more of these roles and really figure out where they live in terms of their role in capacity building for the organization. Okay, I'm going to get even more specific. What can the board, if the board's role is, again, to be an ambassador to help ensure adequate funding for the organization during this time, what specifically can they do? Well, most of us are helping the organization to think about the what ifs. And therefore, okay, and we'll talk about this a little later in the webinar, but we're thinking about rewriting our story. We're thinking about reframing our case for support. I'm guessing that you have people on the board who are great at doing that, who are good writers, who are great people to test this new case and this new messaging on. Make them part of developing that new story. Give them the facts and the information that they need in order to understand how this crisis is impacting or not impacting the work that you're doing. How are you getting around that? Again, if you're a school, I see all these schools doing tremendous work providing online learning. Not all of it's tremendous, by the way, but there's a lot of fantastic programming out there that's being offered through the JCC, through the schools, through the synagogues, through social service organizations, all of the free and complementary programming. I'm seeing all of this sort of like group therapy work being offered in a complementary way to the world. So how do we get that information to our board members, and how do we help them be able to tell that story to their constituents? That's what's important. Asking them to help you reframe that case, and then sharing that story out on their social media, verbally, webinars, whatever it is. But people are really searching for or yearning for that contact with people and a role to play. They want to help. So give them the job to do. You must give them talking points. You must share information that they can reshare on social media. And maybe most importantly, we need to be reaching out to our donor base. I just talked to a synagogue yesterday, one of our clients, who told us that they have a 550 member congregation and that the board recently completed calls to every single family. And now they're going on round 2, every single family. That's exactly the kind of work that the board should be doing. Wellness calls, check-in calls. Again, we'll get to solicitation because we really are past the point where we're telling you to hold off on asking. Many of you cannot hold off. You financially cannot withstand an entire spring without fundraising. We understand that. But if right now the role that the board can play as a group, as a team, is reaching out to donors, fantastic. Make sure that they have the assignments, that they have talking points, and that they understand that the goal of the call is to check in, is to see how donors are doing, and to let them know that the organization is thinking about them. Second, you should be a part right now of some pretty tough conversations about ensuring adequate funding for next year. So those conversations, again, if you've already approved your budget, I think we're back to the drawing board. If you've already asked families to indicate a need for financial assistance, you probably have to survey them again. Things have changed and will continue to change all spring. And therefore, your board should be speaking on a continual basis about how the budget has to change for next year. And if families need increased support, there's really 2 ways to go about doing that, because I doubt you're going to increase your fees dramatically this year. So one is to raise more money, is fundraising, and the second is to cut expenses. Both will be challenging endeavors. Your board should be engaging about that conversation almost constantly at this point. So for boards who have not met or spoken in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, I have a big, scratching my head moment about that. I would say that these boards should be engaging even for a 20-minute check-in every 2 to 3 weeks minimally, because things are changing so fast. We're talking about opening facilities, closing facilities. What are we offering virtually? What are we not? And not that the board has to be engaged in every single strategic decision. Again, I think Alisha is going to touch on that in a minute, but they need to have the information. They need to know about the decisions you've made, your timeline, your lack of a timeline. They need to understand what's at stake here. And if the answer is that you have to raise a lot more money next year to ensure that families have the support they need, your constituents, your students, whoever, have the support they need, that's the board decision, and the board needs to step up and accept that responsibility. And last, I will say that the board's work, again, I defined at the beginning, is to really own and drive strategic planning. And so the strategic plan may need a rewrite at this point. All bets are off, right? So how are your goals looking different for next year? How are your objectives, your tasks, your strategy is going to change in light of what's happening right now? So I think you got to pull that plan off the shelf, and the board has to re-engage, even if it's for a 12 to 18 month plan. How does that plan look different? What does the work of the board committees look like now that our world is in upheaval? What has changed? What has not changed? And again, how does that plan look different? So the board must be involved in strategic planning conversations right now. You have a lot to do, right? At the end of the day, you have a lot to do. So if the board is not meeting right now, if you're not engaging, if you're not talking fairly regularly, something's a little bit wrong. And I challenge that way of functioning, because I think there's a lot to think about and talk about. And we as a professional team must ensure that the board is up to date. And the last thing I'm going to say before I throw things over to Alisha is that I mentioned before, we really do need to get comfortable with asking right now. We recommended on 2 of our last few webinars that we take a break, or think about taking a break, if you can, from major gift fundraising. We're now 6 weeks, 8 weeks, I don't know, how long have we been in this? We're weeks. I've lost track of time, really. Let's just say we're weeks and months into this. And again, I don't think that any donor thinks that nonprofits can withstand months and months of no fundraising. Most of us are fundraising most of the year. And so if it's only to plan even for next year, if you're readying an emergency relief campaign for next year, you must start soliciting now. You must be reaching out to your donors. And again, in an unapologetic way. Right? Your work continues. They want it to, because they are investors in the work that you do. They are stakeholders in the work that you do. They want it to happen. If they cannot make the gift, if they cannot increase the gift, guess what? They'll tell you. If they can't do it, they won't. But there are people out there that can and will. And I'm not just telling you based on theory. I'm talking to organization after organization that is soliciting some beautiful support from funders out there, from philanthropists out there, even donors who've never made a major gift before, but really want to step up and support the work of the organization. Those people are being asked, and they are coming through. So if you are still in the camp, if your board is still in the camp that we really shouldn't ask, it's obnoxious to ask, we're not being sensitive if we ask, someone else is. I promise you, someone else is. And people who want to help are making those gifts right now. I mentioned in our last webinar a give.org study of 1,000 adults across the US the last week in March, and 30% of them said they will give more in 2020. They will give more in 2020 than their average gift over the last 3 years. So they're ready to give, the people who can. The people who can't won't. And there's nothing wrong with asking. The people who can will. And if you're not asking, then some other organization's needs will seem more emergent than yours. And so I encourage you to rethink that assumption with your board that now is not the time to ask. You either need to be planning for that ask, or out there quietly asking your major donors to help you make that change, help you respond to those needs you anticipate experiencing next year. Okay. Alisha, I'm going to stop sharing for a few minutes. We can come back to the screen. And Alisha's going to sort of lead us through other things the board needs to be thinking about and doing right now.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to pull an audible a little bit and just reinforce a few things that you said, if that's okay. Great. And then I will get to the operational concerns, but I also want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. So I will, as I've also been seeing some of your questions populate, I'm going to try to work through some of those. The one thing I would say for sure is, and the last slide really pointed to it, is that your board needs to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And so I think in the slides about, whether you're an ambassador, an advocate, an asker, I understand that many of you are having difficulty, and it's not just people on this call, it's conversations I've had over and over and over and over again with people whose board members are not comfortable or ready to do any kind of solicitation. And I really would emphasize what Amy says, is that if no one is going to question the need of funding right now. Like if you are a nonprofit, you are de facto in need of funding. Like it doesn't even really necessarily matter what your position is right now. You can be in a great cash position and good through the year, but next year you are going to have concerns. So I think that no one will question the authenticity of your need right now. So I just want to make sure that that's, even if you aren't an essential service or a social service provider, what you need to think about is what is and this goes back to the story piece, what is the unique value proposition of your organization, right? So if you're a synagogue, right, you're building community and taking care of the community right now in ways that other people aren't, right? If you're a school, obviously you're providing essential tools, right now. And I think that I would just, whatever you are, even if it's not, I've heard this over and over, we don't work with vulnerable populations, so I feel bad asking. You do provide something core of value, and maybe not everything that you provide is necessary, but you need to come to what is the essential thing that you provide, and that's your story. And if you need help with that story, we can talk about that. But I think that I have yet to meet an organization that can't give me at least one essential service that they provide right now. So that's the one thing I will say to kind of cap off that. The biggest tension, this builds off of what I just said right now, I see between the CEOs and the senior staff professionals and the boards, is this blurring of lines between what role the board plays, right? And so in a perfect world, and if you had my slide deck up, right, I would say the CEO is operations, right? The board oversees the CEO, who actually makes all the operational decisions. That is like the gold standard. That is what we live by, and it very rarely bleeds through unless you're talking about a founding board or something like that, who's actually much more hands-on. Right now, operations and roles and decisions of the board are quite blurry. Right? When you're talking about mass layoffs, or you're talking about furloughing, or you're talking about disposal of properties, or you're talking about closure of schools, or you're talking about things that actually affect the budget, that actually is the role of the board. So there's two things there are two scenarios I think that are playing out. There really aren't really much in the middle. One is the board is completely disengaged and letting the CEO, kind of run the show, which can work if it's however, realize that the board is ultimately responsible for the decision the CEO makes, right? So I won't get into liability and all of that, but we can talk about that separately if you want to, you can call me later and we can discuss it. But, whatever those decisions are, the board is ultimately liable for those decisions. That is their fiduciary responsibility. So if you're on a board, right, and you see all these decisions being made, I would re-engage or think about whether or not you want to re-engage, because that is actually the oversight of the board and one of the key roles of the board. And so I would keep that in mind. The other more concerning, frankly, issue is when the board is overstepping into operations, right? And there isn't that trust relationship with the CEO. And right now it's very hard to build trust. So I would say that's where the CEOs and the senior staff professionals really need to establish communication, and really good communication with the board, because generally speaking, the CEO, does have the pulse on what's going on, but, the board as stakeholders, are, and in many cases, especially let's say schools and other places where the board constituents often are also users of the service, right? This can get very tricky. So I would just kind of check yourself and to see where you are as a board and senior staff in terms of how you're making those decisions in terms of those particular things. The other thing I'd like to just point out, and I'm going to kind of wrap up a bit because we have a lot of really good questions, is that as a board, there's a couple of things I just want to provide a board perspective and a staff perspective. From a board perspective, I just want people to think about when we're making these decisions, right, about cutting program, cutting staff, all of these things, these are real losses for the organization. Right. And I think we need to remember that. I mean, I sit on 4 boards and I talk to board members all the time who are, making difficult decisions. And if you're deciding to cut a program or you're deciding to lay off people, it is a loss to the organization. And I think that kind of removal from program can be helpful, right? Because we can look at numbers and make decisions without that emotional attachment, but understand that the staff have been maybe working on these things for years, sometimes even decades. Right? And this is something that they feel tremendous emotional attachment to. And I think that we just need to be very, someone I spoke to the other day uses radical empathy, right? We need to be very empathetic right now to what people are going through. From the other side of it, right, from a professional staff point of view, what I like to tell people is, look, the people that you're engaging with the board are volunteers. Right. So, they also have all of these other things going on in their life. Right? Maybe their business is crashing, they're homeschooling their kids, they have all of these, maybe they just got laid off, all of those things. And they are dealing with those also. And by the way, volunteering to work to help you try to save your organization. So I think that that's just something to keep in mind. I do think constant communication is key. I agree. If you haven't had some sort of emergency or out of season board meeting, I also am scratching my head. I do think that these things need to, this communication needs to be key. There has to be a regular cadence to the communication, but also, be sensitive to the fact that these people are also going through some of these things. And I think it's also okay to have the conversation. Amy and I talked about this in prep for the call. Like, some people just need to disengage, and that's okay. Right. But instead of kind of getting frustrated with people's disengagement or, trying to get people to engage, I think having a proactive conversation and saying, look, if you can't do this right now, this can look one of two ways. You can step back, right, and just say, look, I'll come back and re-engage when I'm ready. And that looks a variety of different ways. I will say, as a board member, and putting my lawyer hat on, like, if you decide to actually do that and stay on the board, you still are actually liable for whatever the board does. So just keep that in mind. But I think really having that conversation and being proactive can take some of the pressure, out of a situation where you're not having active board engagement. There's one other thing I'll say, and then I will stop. With respect to the scenario planning that Amy alluded to at the beginning, that is something I think that the senior staff and the board do have to be doing in very close alignment, because they are reflecting the budget and all of those things. And I think that that's something that generally isn't a whole board proposition, and maybe you want to create a task force, right? That's the one thing that we kind of, and Amy can disagree with me with what she sees, so she will if she does, but I've seen a lot of organizations actually creating like a COVID task force, right? And that can look different ways. And the best thing about a task force is you can assemble it and then you disassemble it, right? And so if you have like 4 or 5 people on your board who are, have the bandwidth, have the expertise, want to engage on this, and people trust them, right? Like, they can do a lot of the scenario planning without having to convene or figure out where it goes. So that's just something to throw out there, but you should be planning for multiple scenarios, right? So if anyone tells you and I'll say this, I'll quoting someone else, they know what's going to be happening in September, they're lying. Nobody knows, right? Like, so, we don't know what's going to be happening with school. We don't know what's going to be happening with social distancing. We don't know where anyone is going to be going. And those are all budgetary concerns. And so consequently, what one needs to be doing is playing out a variety of different scenarios with a variety of different budgets, with a variety of different revenue streams. And that can be very complicated. And some people can do that in-house, right? And have the people within there, and that's a really good time to tap your board for people who have that planning. But sometimes you really have to say, look, the best investment we can make is to actually go outside and help us with this strategic planning. Like, this financial planning is beyond a lot of CFOs of nonprofits. Sorry if you're a CFO, but this is not something that we do all the time. And they're stretched right now anyway with PPP and trying to figure everything else out. So that may be the best answer and actually could save you a lot of time and effort in the interim. So I will stop there, and we can move from there.
Great. You touched on this, but we have another question about this. How do we get we have several questions on this, so I'm summarizing. Yeah. Some from health-based nonprofits, animal rights nonprofits, child welfare. How do we get our boards to do person to person? I mean, obviously, when people say face to face, I think they mean Zoom to Zoom at this point, but face to face, like one-on-one asking right now. Some people on our board are saying, we're not first responders, we're not a food bank, like you touched on before. Is this really the time for us to be going to our major donors and asking for those gifts?
So I would say a couple things. I would say, first, if you haven't talked to your major donors, like, everyone should have had a conversation with their major donors, right? So let me just start with that. Like, whether it's an ask or it's not an ask, you should have been in touch with them just to explain what you're doing and all of that. I always say, people are like, well, I'm sending them emails with updates. No one's reading the updates. Like, if you have COVID-19 update in your email right now, it is, wherever it is on your email. And so if you actually have your major donors, you absolutely, in my opinion, should have had a conversation with them at the very least to talk about how you're pivoting, right? For sure. But at the same time, if you have a relationship with them and they understand your value proposition, what I would discuss with them is, and this is the conversations that actually, we've been having with our donors, is that this is how we're pivoting to meet the needs right now, right, of our constituents. Because those people do care. If they donated to you before, they care about your mission and they care about your constituents, right? I mean, de facto, one would assume. And so if you are pivoting in a way to provide services or whatever those services are, or trying to actually ask what those needs are, it's very hard to say you won't find something essential in there, and I can, for example, I'll give you one, a quick example. Right now, board member development is not exactly high on everyone's priority list, right? Like in terms of spending money, right? I'm going to be very open and candid, right? But what we're doing right now is talking to our donors and saying, look, like we're providing this need to board members right now who are going through this crisis, and we're providing support, and we're providing information, and we're providing coaching, and we're providing office hours, and we're doing all of these things to help them through, right? And that's something that resonates, right? So I think that's part of the storytelling piece, is like, what are you providing? If you aren't pivoting, right, and you're maintaining the status quo, that's something to think about too, because that's not the best story right now. Just to be perfectly candid, and saying we're laying low till this all shakes out is not the story you want to be going with to your major donors right now.
Yeah. Or even, how are you preparing for the fall? I mean, what is happening? How is the organization being proactive? I think the mistake here is to assume that people only want to give to organizations that are functioning as first responders or food banks. If your donors care about the work that you do, they still care about it, right? Don't rank it for them. Don't prioritize for your donor. I might be someone who supports organizations that are working to help victims of domestic violence. I care more about that than I ever have, because I'm nervous about people being stuck in their homes with abusers, right? So again, there's a story to be told here for every organization. If you're an animal rights or animal welfare organization, how is this crisis impacting your ability to do your work? What are we worried about right now? If people care about animal welfare before, if they did, they care about it now, and maybe more so. So I think that we're nervous about asking, we're uncomfortable with the asking, and maybe some of that is legitimate. Like, is this really a sensitive time when people are seeing their portfolios take a nosedive or they're losing jobs? Yes, but please don't let that get in the way, your discomfort get in the way of having conversations with people who are looking to help, have the ability to help. So your own discomfort is preventing you. That's what I was talking about when I talked about the unapologetic ask. We can't let our own discomfort get in the way. It's okay to feel a little uncomfortable as a board member and push through that discomfort, because that's what the organization needs of you. That's what the board needs of you. It's okay. So how do we get we have like 4 questions. How do we get our boards to do this? How do we get them to do that one-on-one fundraising? You really need to find some of your board members should be really utilized as, like Alisha just said, as people calling to check in with those donors. It is much more comfortable to solicit a gift from someone who you've recently spoken to. It is quite uncomfortable to solicit a major gift from someone who hasn't heard from you in 6 months or 6 weeks. So I think engaging the board in those stewardship calls for right now, so that they are more comfortable when it comes to that donor already has the story from that board member in terms of what's going on, has information, and then they can plant the seed for a later ask. Make it comfortable.
I just want to say, I mean, I've heard from more in my previous life. I was the executive director of a foundation, and this is going to be fairly blunt, but I've heard from a lot of my colleagues, like, if I haven't heard you from the last 6 weeks, like, if I don't hear from you soon, you're not on my radar. I mean, no matter what that is, and that's not just social services, right? It's like, if you're not in contact with me right now to tell me what it is that you need, then that you're getting in the queue, right? Like all the way to the line. And I think that that's key. I also think that I've been on a couple of calls, with organizations who, if I ask you also, like, how's everything going? And your answer is, oh, it's fine, we're in great shape, blah, blah, blah. I think you're lying. Like, I don't mean that in a way, like, tomorrow you're going to close your doors, right? That's not what I mean. But I think there is also a sense of, and I know that there's a lot of disconnect that I've heard anecdotally between being transparent and vulnerable right now. And I think in terms of your soliciting of funding, in terms of engaging with donors and stakeholders. And there is not a single nonprofit I have talked to that hasn't taken some sort of serious hit for this. And even if it's a social service agency that's flooded now with money, like many social service agencies are actually in a better position now than they were in March, but their needs are higher and they have other expenses that they didn't anticipate incurring, right? So even if your fundraising is going well because of what you do, your expenses are increasing. But I would say that be unbelievably transparent. And I know that that's very hard for people right now. And it also depends on the level of sophistication of the person you're talking to. But people know that you have concerns and you have challenges, and there is no reason that you don't. And it doesn't mean that you've mismanaged. It doesn't mean you didn't prepare for a rainy day. It doesn't mean you didn't do any of these things. If you prepare for a rainy day, you're in a good position, but 6 months from now, when your 6 months cash reserve runs out, you're not going to be. And I think showing that you're trying to prepare for that will show that you're managing the organization and the situation well. So I would say I know a lot of board members who are uncomfortable showing that side right now. And I would say if the time ever is to be perfectly transparent with where you stand as an organization, it's now, which can be hard. And I understand, I get that.
Yeah. Listen, again, if there, I would say like half of our questions are about board members who are not fundraising. So I think that that's really the question of the moment. I think that number one, you have to prop up the ones who are. So even if it's just one or two people really making those, whether they're making stewardship calls or solicitations right now, the rest of the board has to hear about it. They have to be talking about it during your board Zooms, talking about that experience, normalizing it, talking about how easy and friendly and fulfilling that it was. Because truthfully, those conversations are fulfilling. They're really exciting when you hear someone is continuing to be willing to step up. They really appreciate the phone call. So I think share that information so that the people who are doing it serve as models and mentors for the people who are not. Second, now is the time to think about, again, it takes time. I always say it takes 2 to 5 years to change culture. I really believe that 2 to 5 years to change the culture on the board. And so now is the time to be really thinking about who and what you need on the board, building the board that you need. And as Alisha said, if there are people who cannot do it, give them permission to step off, right? I would rather you have a smaller, stronger, powerful, accountable board of 8 people, honestly, than a group of 20 who do nothing. Because when I see that the person to my left and to my right, no one's picking up the phone, no one's Zooming with donors, no one has to do anything, then I don't feel I have to do anything. But if I'm sitting around with 8 people and the other 7 are making these phone calls, are asking donors and foundations can continue giving, are sharing the case for support, are sharing things out on social media, then I feel like, I better step up. I'm motivated by what other people are doing around me. And so I don't mean, excuse half your board. I do mean prop up the people, highlight the people who are doing that great work, give them the coaching and the training that they need to do it. Please don't assume. I just talked to someone who said, I got this list of people I'm supposed to call. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. You can't assign calls without giving talking points. So the first thing I would do with a board who is not typically asking for gifts is assign them stewardship conversations right now. Don't give them a list of 20 people, give them 2 to 3 at a time. Let them experience success with those 2 to 3 and then give them 2 to 3 more. It's slowly starting them in on that. Let's have you have conversations and contacts with donors. Okay, Alisha, I have another question. Should board members demonstrate leadership in their gift giving? Should they increase their gifts if able in this crisis and do so publicly with the hope that others will follow?
So that's a hard one, only because you have to understand the situation of each board member, right? And so I think that, I've had a number of conversations with people whose board chairs are, have businesses who are imploding, right? And they just don't have the ability. I do think that if your board has capacity right now, now is the time to ask them to step up publicly, to step up even if it's not publicly, but at least amongst themselves, right? Because there can be that kind of pressure within. I do think that is an area to be sensitive about, and to the extent only because you know, you don't know everyone's personal circumstances. And so I think that it can be done in a way, if it can be done in a way that is sensitive to that, I think that it's actually a valuable tool. And I think from a funder perspective too, it shows some level of confidence in the organization and engagement by the board, you know, whether it's just money, but at least engagement by the board and the board taking responsibility. There has to be, you know, at least some intel as to kind of what's going on, and some people are more public than others. The other thing I would say too to keep in mind is that, and now people don't think about this, is to say, look, you know, I will increase my gift, but I'll increase it over the next 12 months, right? Like I don't have the capacity personally to increase my gifts to the boards that I go to, that I'm on, but I do have the capacity maybe to do it over time, right? And so I'd also think about maybe what that might look like, and because the aggregate is what necessarily people care about. So I would think, I think it's a valuable tool, but I think I have to do it carefully.
Yeah, I agree. I think months or even years. I mean, maybe asking someone to make a multi-year gift or a multi-year pledge can be helpful. I've heard about some organizations are asking board members who are able, right? There's always the who are able to pay their pledges early on a major gifts campaign, right? Or even an annual campaign. So is one of the things they can do now, maybe they were taking 12 months to pay out a gift that they just made, a pledge they just made, but are they able to do it in 3 months or in 6 months to help infuse some cash into the organization right now? That might be something you can ask board members to do.
Yeah, the only caveat I would say to that is in terms of your cash planning, and we're doing this too with respect to the foundation that I used to work for, is we're accelerating all of our gifts. So the one thing, like we literally just accelerated all of our gifts. And a lot of people are asking their boards to put money in now. Just in the scenario planning, make sure you understand that you're not going to get that money later.
That's right. That's right.
So if you're accustomed
to budgets,
right?
Yeah.
So if you're accustomed in your cash planning to getting gifts later, having board gifts come in towards the end of the year, or like whatever it might be, you just have to understand that will, you know, kind of just kick the bucket down the road, right? So just keep that, or kick the can. I think it was kick the can. So I think I would just make sure you're taking that into account as you're asking people to do that.
Yeah. We have a question about fundraising that says, do you recommend soliciting funds to support a specific program that is in jeopardy? Or just asking for general operating? That's what they want to know.
So right now, you know, it's interesting because there's always a question about funders and individuals who want to restrict their grants and all of that. And I think right now, to the extent one can solicit general operating, it's the best possible thing you can do because you need as much flexibility as possible. And we're actually a lot of foundations, and if you haven't already, you know, going to your institutional donors and asking them to unrestrict funding. I think it's a question just to ask, and some are and some aren't. I think that if you are really tied to having a program continue and it's, say, a huge revenue generator, I don't know, whatever the reason is, you know, if you can deliver on that program, first of all, keep that in mind. And it's really important, you know, I don't see a harm in it if you don't think you'll get general operating support, but I would build in management fees. So if you're not accustomed to building in some sort of operational or management unrestricted support into your program grants, I would absolutely start doing that now, because at least you can get some unrestricted capital from those program specific grants.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a good answer. What about, we have a question that says, what about the recruitment of new board members at this time? We're a small education foundation tied to a school district, and normally we'd be asking people to come on board. Maybe doesn't seem like we'd be successful doing that right now. And maybe we don't have the strongest nominating committee function. What would you say about bringing new people on right now?
So I'm interested to hear what you have to say too, but this is, no, really, because this is a question I get a lot.
Definitely, yeah.
I am generally counseling people not to bring on new board members right now, for several different reasons. One, just think about what the onboarding process looks like. Think about what the vetting process looks like. You may or may not have a formal, nominating and vetting process, not something to talk about. But for those that do, it's very hard right now. And I was on the phone with an organization who says, "Hi, I'm onboarding 5 new people in June to take in July." And I'm like, why? Like, why, and, maybe they need to, and this has been in process for a long time. And if it has, and you feel comfortable and you've been talking to them for 6 months and they understand and they still want it, great. But in terms of, and that was kind of the answer. So it is what it is. But I think in terms of just that general turnover right now, I would be very wary of trying to do that in a thoughtful way. I would say on most of the boards that I'm on where the terms are up in June, and most of the boards that I'm seeing, they're asking people just to extend for 1 year. And many people are understanding, and it's still, if you have staggered, just everyone's extending for 1 year, right? So if you're going to ask about people rolling off at different times, everyone's extending. And people who can't and aren't engaging, guess what? They're saying no. And they're getting off, right? So that's also a very natural way of getting people who aren't engaging to have that conversation off the board.
Yeah.
So
no, I agree with you. I think it's a tough time to onboard new board members. I think it's, like you said, totally situationally dependent. If you have the resources to do it properly, and you need people and you have interested people and you've been working to cultivate these relationships, and maybe this person has sat in on a couple of board meetings, then it might be something you can do, and you may need to do it. On the other hand, if you cannot give it the proper attention, perhaps consider adding a volunteer. Remember what I said before, a great volunteer does not necessarily make a great board member. So it doesn't mean not to bring on committee members or other volunteers during this time. It's a great way to get to sort of test the waters with them to see if they'd be a good board member, by the way. So I would say if you've got that opportunity and there are tasks to be accomplished and strategies that need work, maybe bring someone on as a volunteer or committee member right now instead. But I think it sort of depends.
I agree completely.
Okay, so here's another great, I think this is a good one for you, Alisha. We're predominantly federally funded, limited history with individual donors and private foundations. This is a fairly new CEO providing crisis services for homeless and at-risk youth across the country. They have an amazing story to share. Does it matter that they'd be reaching out now as a grantee prospect? Could they get in front of foundations? Are foundations right now funding new grant recipients? Or are they really trying to help those with whom they already have relationships?
So the answer to that question is yes. I can tell you that both individual donors and foundations are looking at giving in social service areas. So this is the other side of the coin, right? For people who are looking at new areas and social service areas where they never would have before. I've talked to a number of organizations and also people consulting organizations who were in crisis before this, right? Because they were social service organizations. And it was, it's a whole discussion, but, and they're just having this influx of new gifts. And I think if you are serving anyone who served a quote vulnerable population, and what I mean by that is anyone who's serving issues with homelessness, food scarcity, older adults, and anyone dealing with people who are otherwise abled right now. And we can go into why everything is getting more expensive. Some of it's obvious, some of it's not. I think you absolutely have an opportunity, actually, frankly, to get into foundations. And I think especially with the foundation, I would sort of make one point is that if it serves the city, right? So if it's a national foundation that isn't local focused, that's a question. But if you live in, Chicago, Boston, where, San Francisco, where you actually have the foundation has an interest in serving that particular region, I would absolutely get in front of them. No question. No question at all.
I agree. And, I know that a Better Chicago, I don't know where this organization is located, but I know Better Chicago just put out $500,000 in emergency funding, and any organization could apply for those funds, and they're going to do another round soon. So I think there are some foundations that are looking to support first-time frontline responders.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you again, the foundation that I worked for had given social services just into a fund, generally speaking. And for the first time in 13 years is looking to give out social service grants to specific organizations, which they've never done before. So I would highly encourage people who have that story to tell to put it out there for sure.
Yeah. We're running out of time. I think our last question, because we have a lot like this, that the board is lukewarm to fundraising right now. How do we get them more on board with the fact that we need to be fundraising?
So I think there has to be a sense of urgency, right? I think you're the capacity building expert. So I'm going to only take a second on this. So I'd like you to actually answer this because I want to hear what you have to say. But I think you have to have a sense of urgency, which means you have to actually play out these scenarios. And I think the organizations who are feeling comfortable for whatever reason and haven't played out the sense of any scenarios are not communicating that then to their board. And if your board doesn't know that, okay, in 6 months, literally we run out of cash, or in 6 months, literally we have X, Y, and Z scenarios playing out, there isn't this sense of urgency. And your people came onto the board because they care, right? And if they care, they want you to exist, right? Otherwise, they really should not be on your board. And that's a different thing. But I think that is the ultimate way to engage your board right now. And I think some professionals are not communicating that sense of urgency because they're afraid of how the board will respond. That's my
right. I think you're right. I think unless the numbers are in front of them, the financial scenarios are laid out very clearly in front of your board. This is what we anticipate facing. This is what we generally give away, raise, whatever in a typical year. This is what we think we need this year. There will be no option. Either you will have to cut expenses or you'll have to raise more money, and likely both. The board needs that in black and white in front of them to tell that story, because once they see that, they'll see they have no other option but to begin fundraising. And it might be quietly approaching your top 10 donors, but that's the work that has to be done right now. We are out of time. We have several questions that we did not get to. I promise we will answer every single one of them in writing. You will have an opportunity to sign up with us for complimentary 30-minute coaching with a member of our team to get your your questions answered, not your answers questioned, maybe that too, in the very near future. And you'll get a link also, not only this recording, but to the COVID-19 page on our website, where we have lots of free resources. So tune in there, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. I want to thank Alisha Oberman for giving us her time and expertise so generously. Thank you, Alisha. I love talking to you.
No, it's a pleasure. I always love talking to you. I always learn. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.